fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. We got Mr. Dave Martino back in the room.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Back in the room.
Yeah. You've been
Back up from the basement.
Yeah, you've been hiding out for a while, I know. It's
yes.
Just like, we'll start calling you Double Scoop.
Because of the cat.
Because of the cat.
Because my neighbor's cat comes in and uses my cat's litter box.
I think that's rude.
Yeah.
I really do. I'm telling you, I would go to my neighbor's house and just use her bathroom. I would just walk in and say, sorry, I got to use the bathroom, Your cat uses mine, No, I wouldn't. I'm just being that way, troublemaker. Allergies, so I'm in that kind of mood,
Mode.
I want to cause trouble. So we got trouble here today. We've got a writer. That's always trouble, right?
Yeah.
And book. His latest book is called Third Wheel, and it's Richard R. Becker. So we're glad to have you here, Richard. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Nice to meet you, Dave. I'd definitely go over there and use that bathroom.
I think so. It's rather forward, I would think, Just,
we call her Double Flush.
Yes, Double Flush. There you go. See, now we've got it. Now we got that. That's Dave's name tomorrow.
Perfect.
Double Flush. Double Flush Dave. That
Flush.
Works. Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
So what would make, I always ask this question of someone, because you haven't been on the show before, so we'll ask how you got into writing. And I always think, well, why would a rational, sane person go into the world of writing? Like, who hurt you?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. No, I never intended to be a writer. So it was an accident. So there you go. That kind of explains it. No, I think when I was a kid, I was really good at, storytelling, and my medium was art. I wanted to be an artist, and that was my plan. Other than I couldn't figure out how to make a living as an artist. So when I went to college, I went to Whittier, where Richard Nixon went, and they were going to teach me how to be a psychologist, and that took about a year before I realized I didn't want to be a psychologist, because you can only do like two things, right? You can listen to people's problems all day. You could teach a mouse how to press a bar for cheese. That was about it.
I do that now.
You do that now, yeah. So I went to, I transferred, because they wouldn't let me switch majors there. And I transferred to the University of Nevada, Reno. And I was meant to do like art and psychology. I thought that's how I would get into advertising, marketing, things like that. And they said, no, we have a journalism program. We'll teach you how to write, because we have an advertising track in that. You'll learn to be a copywriter. And I was like, really? I didn't even know what a copywriter was at the time.
Sounded good.
Sounded fine. So I started taking classes, and they kind of taught me how to write. I learned the hard way. I used to have my papers were downgraded all the time. I'd start off with a base grade of an A or a B, but then they would deduct like 2 points for every style error, spelling error, things like that. And suddenly I had a D and an F. So I learned to write the hard way. They kind of beat you. I actually used that when I taught. To help people learn to be writers. So for years, I've been working in marketing communications. So that's the kind of writer. I'm a commercial writer, and I've been telling people stories for a long time. And it did occur to me, though, that I do kind of the same thing I've tried to avoid in psychology. I listen to my clients' problems all day, or I teach the consumer to press that bar for cheese, and that's kind of my job now. But then I thought, I've been telling other people's stories for so long, maybe it was time I told some of my own, and that's how I got started into actually writing fiction, more seriously than I had dabbled a little bit when I was younger, but I didn't do anything seriously. And that's how it started. It's just a project to say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and do this. And it took a long time for me to do that, because I think when you're a commercial writer and you're writing every day, it's hard to write after that. And so I always struggled with that. Or there's always deadlines looming, because I also had magazine deadlines and things like that. And I had all these deadlines, and so you want to take care of the deadlines, and you find you never have time, or you just spent 10 hours writing, you don't want to write something else. So I had to learn how to do that. With a couple of friends gave me some advice, and I set out a project, and that's how I got started.
Do you feel attached to all the commercial projects you've done?
That's a great question. What I find is you have to find the right story. If you don't have the right story, then you probably won't get attached to it. You have to find the right story within it, no matter who you're writing for. And I've written for a lot of companies that most people and I still do, that most people would find boring, and then I find ways to make them interesting. And I think that's where you find the passion to tell that story. Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's a story, no matter what you're working on. And you have to find the right story. And if you don't have the right story, no, you're not going to connect to it. If it's doing for radio, television, sometimes you have a little more flexibility and creativity. But when it's, let's say, an article or content or a blog post, you have to work a little bit harder. So one of the clients I have actually is, they're a barricade company. So just to give you an idea of how, on the surface, yeah, you're saying, yeah, that sounds exciting. They're a barricade. How do you make that exciting? But then you find out that they're setting up barricades for movie shoots, and you find out that they're setting it up for some of the largest events in Las Vegas, like Formula One or Life is Beautiful, or most recently the Electric Daisy Carnival in Las Vegas, where they're servicing hundreds of thousands of people who are arriving at this event and trying to make it so they can leave without having to contend with traffic, in addition to all the construction stuff that they do. And you start to realize that there's a lot of angles. So you write that story, and then people see, yeah, there maybe is something to this. Like, they never thought of it before. But even when it comes to like special events, you find out that, parking and just getting there to the event and leaving the event end up having a big impact on how we perceive that event. And so talking about that and finding the story is where you find the passion. So I've learned to kind of write about anything, I suppose, including barricades, and I enjoy it.
I guess.
Well, I'm curious, was it a hard transition to go from commercial writing to writing prose fiction?
I think the hardest thing was taking the fiction seriously. Like I said, again, when I was very young, I did dabble with a little bit of poetry and a little bit of fiction writing, but I never went anywhere. After all these decades of writing, I definitely had the skill set, so it didn't intimidate me anymore, and I kind of knew what I was doing. But what I struggled with was finding the time to actually sit down and do the project. And the first bit of advice that really worked for me was, I had one friend who said, you really got to put your project first. And that's how I started off with the first book I did, which was a short story collection. I started by writing one story a week for 50 weeks. And I got that idea actually because there's a graphic designer who did a daily monster, and he did this ink monster. He did one a day for 100 days. And I knew I couldn't write a short story like one a day. So I thought one a week was doable. So I did one story a week for 50 weeks. And I always started on Monday, and I wrote as much of the story as I could on Monday. So Monday became my writing day. And then the rest of the week, because I'd never finish it on Monday, but I could finish it with little scraps of time throughout the rest of the week. And I had a deadline. In my first project with those stories, I'd share them at the following Monday. So I had to get the story done. I had a hard deadline where I was sharing these stories online. And so that kind of gave me the deadline to take it seriously enough to do the job. And that's what it was. I treated it like a job. And I tell a lot of new writers this now, and novice writers, as I tell them that when it comes to fiction writing in particular, is that you have to treat it as a job and you have to take it seriously, because if you want readers to take it seriously, then you can't treat it like a hobby. You can't just say, well, this is my hobby. You want to take a look? No, who wants to read that? But if you say, wow, this is my project that I've been working on, and this is the outcome, then they get a little more excited about it. So you have to take it seriously.
Right, of course.
And that's what you do too, right? When you're writing, Ellen, you take your. Never mind that example.
I take it all serious. It's a job. Like I spend 12 hours a day working every single day. I don't know if I take a day off. And that's of all seriousness, but I really like what I do. And so writing and radio, I'm working all the time. Yeah. And I'm trying to get something out of it. And I'm trying to also put something out as well. And that's kind of what I always ask here. Like, so in your book, The Third Wheel, though you have a story you're telling, but there's also something you get out of when you write a book, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's like any writing that I do, but there's, I think, even more so because it's my story. I have complete control over the story. Obviously, you got to follow the rules of the road, like grammar and whatnot. But I have control of the story. I can literally do anything with the story. I can really, and there's a certain level when you get into like that writing zone, which I'm starting to develop a theory about, I think. When you get into the writing zone, there's a certain feeling that you capture. I don't know if this is the case with you, but it just feels right. And it just feels natural, and it becomes effortless once you're actually in there.
Yeah, like what do you think of storytelling? Like what is it? Like, it's kind of a weird question.
Yeah, no, I think a storyteller is somebody who obviously tells stories, and those stories could be real stories, or they could be fictionalized stories, or they can land somewhere in the middle, right, where you fictionalize the truth to make it sound a little bit better. And I did that a lot as a kid. I was raised by my grandparents for a time, and I spent a lot of time on my own. I had an aunt that lived in the house as well, but she was older, so I had to entertain myself a lot when I wasn't outside and doing things with other kids. I spent a lot of time on my own. I was a little bit troubled in some ways because I wasn't being raised by parents. I wasn't in a traditional household, and we were kind of poor. So I played with army men a lot and toys like that, and my army men had backstories, and I would tell my grandmother that story, and stories about the soldiers I was playing with, or it didn't matter, cowboys, Indians. It didn't matter what it was, and a lot of times I'd do that right in front of the television set, and I'd borrow little bits of what I saw on television and what the movies I was watching into the play activity that I was doing. I think that's kind of storytelling. You just kind of relay your perception, your ideas, and you communicate them to other people in some fashion. And I did that with play acting and verbally, and I would do it a lot with art. I would draw a lot of pictures, and all my pictures ended up being like stories in a sense. I didn't do like an abstract art kind of thing. A lot of times I would do murals, or my grandfather would bring home butcher block paper because he was a painter at the university. He'd paint the halls and dorm rooms and whatnot. So he'd bring home these big rolls of butcher block paper, and I would do these giant murals that would kind of tell the story because I could just roll it out forever. And so I was always doing it that way. Yeah, in fact, the first story I think I ever wrote, I actually translated it because it was initially, I had done it as a school project in like 6th grade as we were doing slides. You had to do like little slides to tell your story, and then you would verbally tell your story. So then I took that visual, and that became one of the first stories I ever wrote. Not really ready for prime time, but it was a story nonetheless.
Yeah, no, and I had much the same childhood, but people weren't around me because they didn't like me. That's a different reason. But yeah, I did much the same. So let's talk about Third Wheel. So what is Third Wheel? What is the book about? What's the basic premise?
So Third Wheel is kind of it's a coming of age story that's actually a little closer to a thriller. Some people have called it a social analytical book that masquerades as a crime thriller. So it's kind of got definitely a cross-genre kind of feel. And it's about a kid named Brady Wilks who moves from the Midwest with his parents to Las Vegas in 1982. And he kind of hooks up with some friends who are perfectly fine friends, and they just do kid kind of things like most kids would do in the 1980s until one of their friends moves away, which opens the door for a different friend to come into the group and start to take them in a different direction toward drugs and alcohol and things like that. And to the nth degree, because the new kid is a drug dealer. And that kind of introduces Brady Wilks into this life of crime. And he doesn't have a very good home life. So as a result of that, it's very easy for him to get caught up into this world of drugs and stuff because he really desperately needs to belong because he didn't feel like he ever belonged anywhere. And now he does with his best friend next door. But now there's this other kid who kind of makes him the third wheel. So he's almost like pushed aside. So he felt like he should be the best friend, but he's not. He's the third wheel in the core group. And then there's other kids that are involved as well. But that's kind of the start of it. And they do get into bigger and bigger drug deals, and that's kind of where the tension and conflict come out, is they're introduced, like the antagonist named Alex. His name is Alex, and he introduces them into this idea that, maybe marijuana isn't the way to go, or a little bit of cocaine here and there. I know some guys we can do a big heroin deal. And that's kind of where they go. So they go off into the desert to do a heroin deal. And that's kind of the plot line goes along that way. And at the same time, Brady does some other more regular kid things because he does have a love interest, although his love interest is a little bit older than him. He's about 14 and she's about 18. But it's because all the kids in his group are a lot older than him. And they range in age from, they're pretty much high school kids. And he just happens to be the youngest one. He's sort of the misfit of the group. The younger brother, almost, in a sense, to his best friend. And that's kind of the story. And because it is in Las Vegas, they actually have a brush up with the mob as well. So you get some tension created by the cartels and the mob in the book, even though that's not really what the story's about. It's really a story about belonging that, like I said, gets presented as a crime thriller.
Well, why 1982? Is there something about the 80s and especially the early 80s, that compelled you to write this novel?
Oh, for sure. So I as I mentioned, I wrote 50 States. And then as a follow-up, I did a little 10-story companion. I don't even always call it a book. It was like a 10-story companion. I just put it on Kindle. It wasn't produced. As a companion piece. And one of the stories out of the 10 stories that I did was called Third Wheel. The original idea was I was going to do all these like riffs off of the stories in 50 states, and I was going to do it 50 times. But then I did Third Wheel as part of this collection that I was working on, and I realized I had a choice at that point. I could either continue to write Third Wheel because it really connected with me, and I'll explain that in a second, or I could continue to write short stories. And then I just thought that the time was right for me to write Third Wheel. And so that's why I decided to make it 10 threads instead of 50 threads. And I started working on Third Wheel for, it was about 24 weeks because there's 24 chapters. I kind of use the same formula in terms of once I'm dedicated, that's my writing process. The reason I picked it was because Brady Wilks and I do share a lot of commonality. We're not the same people, but there are a lot of elements of my life that I brought into the story to make it real. And I think that's why I connected with Brady Wilks so well. Now, he does things that I might not have done, or he does things in a way or sees the world in ways that I wouldn't have necessarily seen it because the character's his own person, and the characters in the book are their own people. But at the same time, I felt really connected to him, and that was just the story I really felt compelled to tell. And at the same time, I thought it would be a good idea just to share that. I think not that there was a lesson intent to it, but I think some people have told me that they've learned a little bit after reading Third Wheel. Like it's entertaining, but at the same time, they come away with it and say, that makes sense to me, that how to maybe find my own identity and how I can make my own choices instead of just letting the world happen to me. I can actually take control of my life and go somewhere else, which is kind of Brady's struggle. He either goes with the flow to belong, or he has to make maybe a harder cut to see, where he ends up. Maybe it's going to be different, but it's hard when you don't have a safety net. You have to make that decision. So that some of that does mirror my life. And I was here in the 80s. The years are a little bit shifted because this isn't reality. So I took some liberties on that. But it was in the 80s that I first moved here, late 70s, early 80s. And I basically did meet a group of friends that we did regular kid stuff with. And then we kind of veered off into this darker, seedier side of Las Vegas, which is so accessible. It really is accessible in Las Vegas. It doesn't have to be, but if the kids don't have structure at home, which I did not, and then it's very easily, you look for structure in other places, and sometimes those aren't the best places to look for structure, and they're easy groups to fall into. So my first group of friends they're kind of nerdy, which introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons. So Brady plays Dungeons and Dragons too. And then he does that with his new group of friends, which is the neighbor and this other kid. But when the other kid moves away and Alex, this antagonist, comes into the picture, then they don't want to play Dungeons and Dragons as much anymore. It's more fun to maybe listen to, heavy metal music and drink some booze out of the liquor cabinet. And
well, that was Dave that.
It's pretty much, the 80s life, right?
Yeah.
Every John Hughes movie except mine has a little darker, more sinister edge to it.
Well, subtext sometimes come out of it organically when you're telling a story, like you don't intend on a meaning or something, but it just sort of happens from just the way the characters act and react, and especially if you're putting a lot of your own reality into characters or story, right? It's part of the truth somewhat. So are you hearing the other characters or the characters in your book? Do you have a relationship with characters when you write them like this?
I do. As they develop, yes, they definitely. A lot of times it happens, at least for me, I connect to them not so much with their thoughts, and I've heard some writers say that, right? When they're thinking about how a character thinks, is when a lot of times it happens in dialogue, and then I find their voice. I find their voice with dialogue, and then I find their voice in how they think. I think the dialogue comes first for me, just the banter that they have, and like I'm working on a project right now, and I found one of the antagonists, because there's several. I found one of their voices because he's having dialogue with the protagonist of the book. And one of them might know, but they don't know where they are in terms of their connection and relationship at the moment, and neither does the reader, although there might be a little bit of foreshadowing. But I found that voice, and I know who he is now, and he kind of creeps me out. So that's good, because he's an antagonist. He's not and I'm trying to, even with antagonists, I always try to remember too, I think from the antagonist point of view, right? I think they think they're the hero of the story. So I always try to do that too. I don't like characters who are they're just bad to be bad. And I do have characters in Third Wheel that are bad. And, a couple antagonists in that book too. Alex I mentioned, but also the mother in the story is an antagonist toward Brady, which is what drives them out of the house. I always try to present them and think about them, and I have to develop a relationship with them because that's the only way you can find how they think they're the hero of the story. Like they think they're doing the right thing.
You know, having wanted to be an artist and doing some artwork, I almost think that you'd also see the story in a visual fashion. Is that correct?
I do. When I'm writing, I tend to visualize everything first, and then I transcribe. I almost feel like I'm transcribing it. I think that's why it feels effortless for me. I actually see it in my head. That's not always the case when I'm doing commercial work, unless it's like radio. Radio is very visual, right? Audio is always visual because you can put anything into somebody's head. But that's how I approach fiction writing. I see it and then I just sort of write it down. I hear it and I write it down, and so that's exactly the process. It becomes so effortless. And then sometimes I go back and actually interject thoughts that they might have during dialogue or during an action scene or during something a little bit more tangible that you see, so that they reflect on it just enough to give a little bit more depth to the character. And I find that's how I get to know them. Sometimes I feel sorry for them. I see that with the readers too occasionally. So like the mother in Third Wheel, for instance, she's definitely an antagonist, and most people do not like her. But there are some characters that say they actually have sympathy for her because in her mind, she's trying to do the right thing for her kid. She just tends to do it with an anvil instead of, not necessarily physically, but an anvil as opposed to, let's say, a mallet or a tap. She tends to be a little more heavy-handed in the punishments that she gives him, and that has a big impact on who he is.
It's interesting. Do you end up doing weird things because these characters tell you to do things?
No, that's a different character.
Oh, just wondering.
I have One in 50 States is a little bit like that, but no, I don't hear voices like that.
No, and you don't wake up with a shovel beside the bed.
No, I don't. No shovel beside the bed or anything like that.
Not this week, anyway.
So,
did you become a natural short story writer then, writing so many short stories, like putting yourself through that?
I think I did, and then even when I approached the novel, I didn't approach the novel like a novel. I approached it like there's 24 chapters, I think. I approached it like 24 short stories to make a novel. I think every chapter is like a short story, in a sense. You have a little bit of flexibility because you don't have to have a hard beginning and ending because you're going to carry it on. But in a sense, you want to kind of you introduce a scene and you run through the scene or multiple scenes if there's multiple scenes in the chapter, and then you find a conclusion that kind of keeps the reader like, oh, what's going to happen next? I want to turn the page and read the next chapter. So I became very natural at writing short stories. So I felt like in the commercial world, though, I kind of did that anyway, especially, again, with television radio, because I was able to write. A lot of times I wrote stories in order to sell the products, to make it interesting, to make it fun. Like if I was working on, let's say, Volkswagen, selling Volkswagens, the one idea that we had is that they had this theme back in the day called Drivers Wanted. That was their tagline for the national, and we wanted to build a local campaign around that, Drivers Wanted. So like one of the radio spots I scripted this idea that there were people in a dating show and they were interviewing cars as, kind of like a little match game kind of thing, like a little dating show game. And then that became the story. And, or another time it might be somebody when they introduced, the first SUV called a Touareg. I knew all the facts about it. And so I kind of played up the facts a bit. So the big thing they were pushing is it could tow an elephant. And it could forge water. And so I kind of put that together and made a story about somebody filling up the street with water so the elephant could ski behind the SUV. So just like really ridiculous things, but it played off. And I've done that with many different accounts. Radio was always kind of fun. And what is it? What is a radio spot? 60 seconds is a super short story. And so that's kind of so I felt like I think I had a grasp of that, but then putting it down into the 3,500 words-ish zone really helped me out as in fiction. I think that kind of did help me out.
Well, so what makes a good story for you? Like when you're writing something, how do you know if it's the one you want to write? You know, when you come up with ideas and it's something you're going to go with.
Yeah, it's just, that's a great question, and it's really difficult to answer because I think you just sort of have to feel it. Like, there comes a point where you just sort of know. With 50 States, it was a little challenging at times working on the different short stories because once it had a theme. So initially I had just started writing these stories and noticed along the way that each story happened to be in a different state. So I was like, well, if I'm going to write 50 stories, I might as well make it 50 states and put each one in a state. So it was harder toward the end, especially on states that I wasn't maybe 100% connected to. So sometimes I would already have a story and I would just insert it into the state. But I ended up having to do a little bit of research to find the story. And a lot of times I started to write stories that I had to abandon quickly because I just knew it wasn't the story. Like, I think Tennessee comes to mind. Like, I meant to write a story about moonshiners and it just wasn't happening. So I ended up writing a story about, this boy who wanted to go find this girl that he met. I think this is the Tennessee story. Well, if I'm wrong, readers are going to have to forgive me now. But he goes to, I was doing research and I stumbled upon this. So anyway, he goes to the bus station to jump on a bus to go see this girl. And that's what the story is kind of about. But he ends up meeting another girl there at the bus station. And she is a pretty unique character in that she likes to pretend that she knows all these different people that are here at the bus stop because she wants to escape too. All these different characters or all these different people to her have backstories, and she just makes up the backstories. Like she'll say, oh, look at that guy over there. This is his backstory, and this is her backstory. And they kind of do that a little bit back and forth, and they make a connection. And she really needs to get away because she's being abused. And he just wants to go meet this girl. But he doesn't even know how he's going to do that because he doesn't have money for it. And she ends up giving him her bus ticket because she wants him to have hope. And so that's kind of the story. So I just kind of introduce characters, have a pretty good strong plot or conflict to go along with it, and then find some kind of resolution at the end. And, I'd say most of the time it ends up working well. I do like to leave my endings a little bit open, because every short story I have, I think, could easily be developed, some probably a little easier than others, into a book in some fashion or another. So I always say, like, I have probably 50 plus book ideas in my head because of all these short stories.
There's a trick to it, or not a trick, but it's a challenge to also write a short story and make sure the reader understands the character well in a very short time. Like in a novel, you've got more time to roll out their feelings, what's happened to them, what they go through, what they're thinking, what their world looks like. In a short story, you have a very limited space on getting that across to the reader. For me, I think that would be the toughest thing.
That's one of the things I actually like about short stories is you have to do it very quickly. So I was recently asked, what drives me? Am I more plot driven or character driven? And to me, I think they have to work in tandem. Because the plot is what drives us forward to make us read a story. The A to B plot, whatever it is. Maybe it zigzags or whatever too, but that's what drives us forward. But if we don't care about the characters, then we're not going to go forward. So you have to make people care about the characters very quickly, and I try to do that. So I haven't really thought of it this way, but since you brought it up, Alan, I think I really just try to find that hook where I feel somebody, and maybe it's just myself in some cases, can identify with the character like, wow, this is this person, and I immediately know why I should care for him. I think if I could find an example, so the first story in 50 States is about a farmer we immediately find out that he's living on his own. He's definitely has some family problems. His wife moved out with the kids. He's barely getting by. The farm's going to start going under. And so we start to care about him. And then we find out the real travesty of it was the reason that all these things happened to him is because one of his children had been reading a book or playing in the field and was run over by the carbine harvester. And that's the story. The beginning of that's the characterization. So we know this is the character. But then we introduce a different conflict into that story, which is somebody comes up to his property, even though he's feeling all these things as he's just working. And there's been a car accident on the highway, and he has to go be a hero. And that gives him this opportunity of self-redemption. And I think that ends up making a good story because we care about him because he's a tragic character, but yet he's being asked to do something that's quite heroic, even though he doesn't have that feeling about himself.
Do you find it difficult to write female characters?
No, not at all. In fact, 50 States, and actually he did the narration work on Third Wheel too. I was very particular about finding somebody who could do great women characters as well as men characters. So I found a gentleman up in Portland named Brian Callahan, and he did the narration for 50 States because he had this huge challenge of he literally had to learn, like 200 characters or so, or however many characters are in that book, and from different regions, and pay it off at different ages and different time periods. And he did it, and it was remarkable. And then I auditioned again for Third Wheel, but he ended up getting it for the kind of the same reason, because he just embraced the characters so well, Brady Wilks. So he was able to do that, and I think he just really connects to my writing. But I bring this up to answer your question is just the fact that I'm equally comfortable writing with female characters, and maybe I don't know why. Sometimes I wonder, maybe it's because. So when I was being raised by my grandparents, my grandfather was really out of the house a lot. So it was just my grandmother and my aunt. So I spent a lot of time, and other aunts and women family members would come over. I spent a lot of time actually with a lot of females, I think, early on. And I wonder sometimes if that didn't have an impact in seeing, I don't have a big gender distinction. I make characters have giant gender distinctions, but I don't necessarily feel, I just see them as people. And then I think now that I think about it, when I was growing up too, there were a lot of times that, although I had a lot of male friends, I hung out a lot with a lot of girls. So if a bunch of girls were talking, and I was the one guy that was allowed to stay at the table. So I was always very comfortable talking with girls. I think maybe they didn't see me as a threat or something like that on occasion, at least initially,
Well, until they saw you.
Until I got more confidence when I was older.
Yeah, then I was like, oh.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Well, listen, so what are your plans here with writing? What do you think you're going to do now that you've got a novel out now and you've done some short stories? Where do you go from here?
Occasionally I write a short story and I send it out on a newsletter I have. I just put it out every quarter, if I'm lucky. Sometimes I don't make that deadline because I want to do it with a short story. So sometimes I still share a short story. Like one of the most recent ones I did, the shortest story in 50 States, it was 3 sentences. And so the people in New Mexico, on occasion feel kind of like I sold them out because I didn't write a longer story. So I actually wrote the story behind the story. And I shared that in my newsletter. So hopefully that made a few of them happy that actually took the time to follow along. But for me, I'm actually working on my next novel. It's going to be a psychological thriller set in Maine, and I've been working on that. And I just recently, stumbled into. I know who the antagonist is, and there's a little bit of truth to this story too. Not my truth, but I actually met somebody who, and I get this all the time. I don't know if you do, Ellen, but people will say, "Oh, I got this great story idea for you since you're a writer," and most most of the time you go, "Yeah, I got 50." So it's. And she told me a little bit about her story though, and I was like, wow. And she would never do anything with it. She wanted it to be done. But when she told me, I was just like, wow, some elements of that I definitely could use in what I'm going to write. So there's some reality that's going to be baked in. Now the irony is kind of like Third Wheel on occasion, I get told. Sometimes, truth being stranger than fiction, they don't necessarily believe some of the story. Like in Third Wheel, a lot of times people will say, oh, there's no mother that's going to punish their kid that much. And I had to scale some of it back. But even though some of that was maybe based in reality. And then with this book, I might have to do the same thing where I have to scale some of it back just because some of the things that she told me just made me go, wow, I just don't know if people will believe that. So, so definitely the next novel is going to be out. And I'm going to continue to write some short stories. I've been dabbling a little bit more with, possibly reaching out to different magazines and having some short stories there. I didn't go that route just because I had my project set on how I wanted to present it to the world initially. And it was successful, so I didn't see a need to necessarily do it that way. But some part of me wants to maybe, send out a couple stories maybe to other magazines to maybe gin up that readership. I do a lot of interviews. I'm going to schedule, my daughter's about to go to college, so I'll be trying to schedule when I take her there. She's going to Illinois, so we'll have a little bit of a road trip. So there and back again, I'm going to see if I can't schedule some book tours and some signings along the way. I might go on some speaking engagements because people have told me it would be kind of worthwhile for me to talk about psychological abuse that children face and how to cope with that, or identity problems or things like that Brady Wilks tends to deal with. Just a lot of things. I do get tied up from time to time because my daughter might be moving to college, but there has been some talk of whether I should continue on coaching high school softball for the school that she recently attended, just because they'll need somebody to carry on and continue to coach softball. So I do tend to get busy when that happens, and of course I have my own company. But in terms of writing, I think I just want to continue to write novels. I already have the one I'm working on. I know what the next one after that will be. And then I know what the next one after that will be. And then maybe I'll come back and tell like the second part of, and maybe third part of Brady Wilks, but not in that order. As a short story writer, I don't know that you might find this interesting or not. What I found is I actually I was thankful to be done with Third Wheel because I had to live, it was the longest I ever had to live with characters. And when you get excited about writing short stories, you're in, you're out, you're done, and you feel a sense of accomplishment. And for a novel, it takes considerably longer to do that. It just felt like it was going for a long, it doesn't feel this way to the readers, but for me, it started to feel like, oh, I can't wait for this to be done. So like I couldn't have written a sequel to Brady Wilks, like a second book immediately. And I know what it is and I know what's going to happen, but I couldn't write it now. I need a break from him and I need to develop other characters and kind of move on. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
yeah, you're promiscuous.
That's what it is. Yeah.
So listen, do you like to interact with readers? Do you have a social media set up? Do you have a website? How do people get a hold of you?
Sure. If they want to get a hold of me, I think probably the easiest thing to do is if they go to bio.site/Richard R. Becker. If they go there, they'll actually find everything there. So they can find me on almost every social network. I do have a blog. It used to be primarily about commercial writing. Now I write about my books on occasion. I might write more about writing as time goes on. We'll see. But I have all the accounts like Twitter, or I should say X now, right? Threads is new, Facebook, all that. And I enjoy interacting with readers. It's they interact with me in different ways. A lot of times, people who are writers tend to interact with me, I think, a little bit more than the readers do. But I don't know if readers feel intimidated or what.
It goes in waves.
You think so? Yeah.
Oh yeah. You'll get. Yeah, and it's usually the people on one side or the other. When they're readers, they're people that love you or hate you, or like what you did, or dislike something, or they want to correct you on something. So that it's kind of more that way.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so I don't feel like I'm interacting with them a lot, but I know they're there and I know they're reading. So I know there's a few people that would probably be considered fans because they share a lot of what I do. They don't necessarily engage me, but they share a lot of the things that I share. And so that's how you kind of get that measurement. And I know this from just marketing commercial work.
Yeah.
That's what
we'll make sure we get some of the ones that don't like you too.
Cool. Yeah, that would make it a little more interesting, There are a few, based on reviews, occasionally you're going to have that, right?
Yeah.
They don't necessarily like your work.
Yeah, even Stephen King, James Patterson, they all have 1 star, so you can't.
Oh, all of them, yeah.
Yeah, some new writer named Stephen King, he's poor guy.
What? Who?
Yeah, poor guy. He's trying to work and they're giving him a bad time.
I know, right?
Terrible. Well, we're going to have your book up and your site information and everything so people can find it easily. And, of course, the book's called Third Wheel, and he's got a few other books, so look for it. Richard R. Becker, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Nice to meet you, Dave. You take care.
Thanks, Richard.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.